Okay, wonderful. So I believe we've got, well, at least we've got Sophie and Hannah here, correct? I think I just saw Hannah come in. Great. So welcome everybody to the Stroud Young Greens talk today. So this is one of our Missing Ed talks, and thank you all for coming. Honestly, it means so much that you're here for this, and it's such a great turnout, and we're really kind of proud and happy and excited for tonight. Actually, our members are going to be basically running this session tonight. I'm just saying hi to everyone. So I'm actually going to pass over to Hannah and Sophie first to introduce tonight.
Yeah, cool. I'll start off. So this event is run by Stroud Young Greens and is part of Missing Ed, a series of informative talks, films, and discussion sessions brought to you by, I already said that, sorry, with the aim of learning with the young people of Stroud about the social and environmental issues that are impacting the world around us. We feel that the school curriculum very often fails to give our generation a chance to learn about and have a say in the most important factors affecting our lives. And then, Hannah, I think, do you want to take over from there?
Yeah. Missing Ed will empower young people by giving them the knowledge and space to share their views on the climate emergency. This is essential to ensure that we all have the right to play a vital role in lessening the impacts of the climate emergency. Yeah, I've finished.
Wonderful. So hopefully that gives you all a little idea of what these talks are about, missing education essentially. And tonight we have a wonderful speaker, and Esther is actually going to introduce our speaker tonight.
Yeah, so we're really lucky to be able to be joined by Mica and to hear from Mica, who specialises in the analysis of soil and crop production data to try and create better understanding of the interactions between human-made systems and natural ecosystems. So over to you, Mica.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you all about this stuff that I'm pretty passionate about. And then I'm going to try to share my screen. So I think I might need a host authorization for that, and then we can get into my PowerPoint in just a minute. So feel free as I'm going through the PowerPoint to kind of stop me and ask questions. If you want, we can stop and ask questions as we go along, or if you want, you can jot them down and we can come back to them later. It's very casual. I'm gonna have it pretty fun. So there's some interesting content and then some pretty flowers and stuff like that to keep it light and interesting as we go. And as I say, don't be shy to stop me and ask your questions as we go. So just give me one moment here and I'll have this PowerPoint up. Does everybody see my screen? Can you give me a thumbs up? And everybody hears me okay?
Yeah,
great. Thank you, Esther. Thank you, Sophie. Cool. So this is getting to know your soil with me, MX Michael or Mica Francis James. I use the pronouns they, them, theirs, or he, him, his. And I did my master's in soil and water sciences with the University of Florida. I currently work as a project manager and really as a farmer, but project manager sounds pretty cool, at Grosvenor Horticultural, which is in Coal Mine, San Grande, Trinidad and Tobago. And here you can see a picture of me with one of our tropical flowers, the Hawaiian torch. It's a pink or a red Hawaiian torch. So this is what our weekly harvest looks like. My dad is currently at the farm picking up the flowers, and I'm going to meet him at the Horticultural Society later, where I will help him offload and mark them all with their stickers and so on and so forth. Some of them are more seasonal, but basically we carry down a big truck like this every Wednesday of flowers from the farm. So for a little bit of context, we are in Trinidad and Tobago. And you'd be flying about 9 to 11 hours to get from the UK to Trinidad and Tobago. I highly recommend you come and visit. Anna can tell you all about how lovely it is. She's always back and forth. And you know, your tourist dollar is important to our economy. A little more specifically in Trinidad here, this gives you where we are. So Sangre Grande is sort of on the eastern end of the east-west corridor, where 1/3 of the population of the 1.5-ish million people live. Sangre Grande is where the farm is, and more specifically, we're just a little bit south of Sangre Grande. So the flowers I promised you, this is Heliconia rostrata. It's one of the varieties we have. I was actually running some of the numbers and looking at the production over the year and seeing, you know, that this flower really comes in around February. So we're just starting to see the first couple blooming, and then they'll be around until June, July. So that's one of the cool things about starting to take data and to study your production, regardless of what you're doing. Even if it's farming, there's all kind of ways where you can record both your activity and your production to like learn about the process and streamline it and improve it. So definitely something cool to think about, even if it's like farming, which is considered low tech, or, you know, not as fancy as finance and stuff like that, but you can still use Excel and all these things in everything that you do. Okay. Next, okay, so I promised you that we'd be talking about soils today. I am pretty familiar with soils, and I'm going to do my best to give you all a little bit of an intro to soils and what they can tell you about both the plants that you can grow and also just how important they are to our ecosystems. So here is a soil map of Trinidad. And in the legend here, we see a variety of different soil series from the St. Augustine, Talparo, Arena, so on and so forth. In the area where I highlighted Grosvenor is, we see this brasso, right? So the kind of cultured soil scientist or the soil expert might look at this map and say, all right, I know what a brasso series is, and then be able to know all kinds of things about the growing conditions, and that's that for the soil. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of what that would be, right? But before that, we've got some more flowers. Here we have the hibiscus, pink hibiscus. I call this particular plant Blossom. She sits just outside the door to our main building at the estate, and I think of her as a bit of a guardian, a little bit of a, you know, a tree spirit there looking out for us and also beautifying the place. The hummingbirds love the nectar from Blossom here. Okay, so back to the soil series. So soil series are defined based on the characteristics in the soil. And the soil horizons is kind of the bare bones of how we define what a soil has, what the layers look like, how developed it is over time. So we start at the surface. You have the O, the organic matter, the humus layer. So this is decaying plant matter pretty much on the surface of the soil. It's becoming soil. Then you have A, the topmost layer of the soil, the A horizon, usually dark in color, lots of organic matter breaking down, and the staining of the organic matter on the soil particles is usually pretty strong. Then you have the E, eluviation layer, basically exit of nutrients, things leaching down in solution, particles moving down suspended in water, or things being dissolved, ions and all that stuff. Then the subsoil is where the B horizon is where things then accumulate. So like your silt and your clay will build up a layer of impermeable particles, and then the water can no longer move down, and then all the things dissolved in the water end up staying in that subsoil, basically the zone of accumulation. And then below that you have weathered parent rock, so unconsolidated rock that might have been broken up by freeze thaw action or the beginning of chemical weathering. And below that you would have the solid bedrock that is like the parent bedrock. And so, of course, depending on the type of bedrock, you'll have all kinds of different rates of development of these soil horizons. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This is another lovely flower. This is a cocoa lily variety that we call the golden torch. So these little stringy orange bits standing up are actually the flowers. So this is many of the tropical flowers that grow on the farm by me are compound flowers, similar to berries. So berries are many little seeds within one flower. And so this bract, B-R-A-C-T, is like a developed leaf that lasts for weeks and weeks on the plant. And then it has actually a series of individual little flowers inside each bract that then can become fertilized and reproduced. So it's a pretty cool type of plant developed specifically for the tropics, where water and all kinds of stuff can accumulate in these bracts and to facilitate fertilization, and even a little mini ecosystem for bugs and critters. So we've talked about soil series, we've talked about soil horizons, but it's almost like we're missing this like overarching question of like, what is the soil, right? So I've talked about like the color of organic matter on the grains and all kinds of things like that. But I wanted to pause for a moment here and open up the floor to you all and ask you, what is soil? There really is not a wrong answer. I would love just, you know, popcorn, don't need to raise your hand or anything. What is the soil?
Well, at a simple level, I guess it's just the ground. That's kind of just what I think of it as. That, I don't know, plants grow in it. Is it made of, sometimes it's made of like decomposed like leaves and things, but I'm not really sure. But yeah, that's what I'd say. Soil is just, yeah.
All right, great. Thank you, Sophie. Yes, the soil is the ground. It's the plant. It's a medium where plant growth happens. Yeah, and it is, yeah, it's where we build things. There's lots of cool uses for it. And so here I'm focusing pretty much on the agricultural use, but there's lots of different ways that soil is important to our society. So the component parts of soil, I'm going to go ahead here, are the solid particle part, right? So here I have a little diagram of like 3 different size ranges of particles. So you have sand particles, which are 2 to 0.5 millimeters or 0.05 millimeters. Then you have silt particles, which are smaller than that, and clay particles, which are tiny, teeny, tiny, tiny. And then the ratio among those different types of solid particles can tell you all kinds of interesting things about the texture of your soil. The soil also has water in it. That water is an important medium for transfer of ions and also just for all kinds of different organisms to live. It has air. So you can imagine if there are lots of little particles, there'll be water, there'll be spaces in between them, and those can be filled with either air or water. And then you can also have organic matter particles, which includes, as I have here, wastes, residues, and metabolites. Metabolites is just a technical term for all of the parts of organic matter either being built up or decaying. And so the organic matter is really a bit of a star in terms of its activity relative to the other stuff. And there's lots of organisms involved in the exchange of bits and pieces of nutrients and molecules. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but I don't want to get too overwhelming with the detail. So here's a bit of a schematic now to take you through maybe like a little, you know, think about a square centimeter of soil, right? We've got these mineral particles up here in brown. You might think of these different colors of brown as different ions and stuff on the different soil particles. Then you've got your organic matter particles, again, with different types of molecules and different proteins versus carbohydrates and stuff like that. And then you've got these pore spaces. So you can have micropores, which are like really, really small spaces, or macropores, which are larger spaces. And depending on whether it's a micropore or a macropore, and then the relative amount of them, it can affect like the connectivity of spaces in the soil and how easily organisms, water or air moves through the soil. And then I'm going to draw your attention down to this schematic in the bottom right, which just again highlights the importance of water for its adhesive and cohesive impacts. So adhesion is when water sticks to other types of molecules, and then cohesion is when water sticks to itself. So that's just really important for how chemical things occur, how things move or bonded or don't move in the soil. This is another gorgeous flower arrangement here. This is one of our primary flowers. It's called the ginger lily, Alpina purpurata. It comes in pink, red, and white varieties. And one of my questions that I'm most interested in researching and figuring out over the years to come is if there's an effect of the color of the flower on the productivity of the flowers, or how many flowers per month or year that it puts out. So that's one of the questions that I'm going to be investigating this year. And I have an intern hopefully coming in towards the May, June to help me answer that question. Great. So the 5 soil forming factors, we've danced around it. I've mentioned them in parts a little bit here and there as we've gone. But the climate is definitely an important part of it. So here we have a map of Trinidad showing you the rainfall, and you can see Grosvenor Estate, which is here, about where my clicker is in the rainier part of the island. I won't get into the northwest trade winds and all that jazz, but suffice to say that the eastern part of the island is rainier than the western part of the island, with important impacts on the rate of weathering and all that good stuff for the soil. The topography, which is the mountainousness or the flatness of the place, matters as well. In this diagram here, you have yellow for kind of more high land parts or land wrinkles, mountains as I like to call them. And then green is more low-lying land. Again, you can think about all kinds of impacts of erosion and movement of particles downslope with rainfall or more or less rainfall. Parent material we touched on briefly before. You could have volcanic soil, you could have sedimentary soil, you could have coral soil, and that's really interesting among the different Caribbean islands. The history of the soil, the parent material, has huge impacts for what the soil today looks like. And then basically time for all of the above, right? So time for the climate to interact with the topography, the rainfall in the valleys, the parent material, and all of those things interacting. And then organisms. Organisms, again, really speed up the show, create a lot of activity. So you can think about like abiotic and biotic factors. So a lot of these are abiotic, sort of chemical and physical. And then biotic is the organisms. And within organisms, of course, we can think about human beings and our huge impact wherever we choose to move, and, you know, excavators to planting and all kinds of stuff. So then this figure here kind of takes all of these different factors and shows you the development of a soil profile. So you might recognize our little soil profile here on the bottom. And so in the beginning, you know, for example, 15,000 years ago, it's just solid parent material. Then slowly chemical weathering happens and you break up the particles and you get the formation of a thin little soil horizon at the top that's differentiated from the parent material. And then what you see here is these organic, these plants, organisms start to get involved, and that really speeds up the show. You get more organic acids, you get breakdown of stuff, you get chemicals and compounds leaching into the soil, you get roots reaching down and breaking up rocks and creating more space for organic matter later on. And then eventually you get these sort of developed soil horizons. Of course, in the ground, it's not going to be a straight line like this, but you do get to see a certain range, and that's where you get your OE or OAEB horizons forming. So here we've got an anthurium. This is another one of our big sellers on the farm. Over the last couple of weeks, I have put out, I think, about 40 new anthurium plants, and I'm hoping to see them blooming in the September, October range. So that's another one of the things with farming. You've got to think long term, and that is one of the big challenges, I think, with the climate crisis in general, is that human beings really struggle to think beyond our lifespan. And what we're really having to do as a society is start to think about the impacts of our actions now on hundreds and, you know, 200-300 years ahead of us. And even though our lifespans are now longer, right, we're maybe on average 80 in the UK or something like that, or 85, 90 is the life expectancy, it's still very challenging for us to think about 200 years into the future and really plan in a very intentional way. So yeah, far less. I mean, you know, I'm like 9 months from now, I may have more flowers. And then this is just a couple of slide figures here of different types of reproduction that you can have. So you can have flowers that are pollinated by bees, and then they get these little seeds growing on them. Or the anthuriums are really cool in that they like bud. And so you'll have a whole nother complete anthurium plant budding off of the side of the original one, which is how I separated and put out all of the new plants. Yeah, so we had some plants, and then let's go back to the soil here. So I was telling you that organisms and organic matter are a big part of the show. They're pretty much a star in terms of speeding up the processes that are happening in the soil that form the soil or change it. So you can have living stuff like roots and organisms, earthworms, insects that are all crawling and making their way through the soil. And then you can have dead and decaying matter. That's pretty much your O material, your organic horizon on the soil, which is breaking down into particulate stuff that eventually becomes, you know, part and parcel mixed up in the soil. And then you have your microbes, which are organisms, but they're sort of distinct in terms of their impacts and of course their size. Microbes are tiny little, often single cell organisms that have no differentiation of sex or gender like more complex organisms have. And one of the coolest things about microbes, which I thought y'all might be interested to know, is that there are certain types of microbes that can pick up fragments of DNA from their environment, and then they evolve, right? So they pick up a fragment of that DNA. So for example, a bacteria, right, which is on the scale here, way, way bigger than the pieces of DNA floating in the environment, can just engulf a piece of that DNA. And then if it's a useful piece of DNA, it can reproduce the compound that that DNA codes for. Which is really cool, and I'll chat a little bit about that more in a minute. And this is just to show you the scale of difference, right? So DNA is tiny, viruses are bigger than that by, you know, 10 times the size. Then protists or simple cells like bacteria and stuff like that are 10 times bigger than that. And then human cells or eukaryotic cells of true cells, don't worry, it's not worth the distinction for our purposes here, but are like way, way bigger. So it's like huge orders of magnitude in difference of size. So yes, I was telling you about bacterial DNA or protist DNA, right? Versus chromosomes and cells in eukaryotes. So this is some biology that you won't get to until secondary school or even like 5th form, 6th form, but like it's cool stuff. So, you know, in context, it's interesting. And if you remember some of it, great. So bacterial cells have unbound DNA, which means that their DNA is just swirling around in the cell, right? And so what happens is that if a bacterial cell dies, it can have this unbound circular DNA, or it can have these little small pieces called plasmids. And so if, for example, one bacterial cell dies and it splits and some of its plasmids are just floating in the environment, another bacteria might come along, engulf that bit of cell, and then it would find this complete circular plasmid. And it might say, oh my gosh, this is such a cool compound. This like plasmid gives me insulin, and now I can store my sugars more efficiently. And that's actually how we produce insulin for diabetic folks. We found the little gene that produces insulin, and we introduce it, we separate it, and then we introduce it into a colony of bacteria, and then we let it produce, we let the colony produce insulin, and then we just separate the insulin afterwards, which is how our folks get what they need, right? Diabetic folks get insulin. And that's one of the really important reasons to conserve our environment and to think about the importance of our soils, because, you know, we might not have known or might not have found all of the cool, exciting bacteria that are in 1 cubic centimeter of soil that could have huge useful impacts for our society. So, there's lots of ways to motivate folks to get interested in conservation. Some people need a dollars and cents value. Some people need to know about the potential value of microbes like this. And then other folks just want to be able to spend time outside and appreciate the natural environment. So, there's lots of different ways to talk about and get people motivated and interested in conservation and stuff like that. And yeah, just compared to the plasmid cell, you've got a human cell or a eukaryotic cell, which has like base pairs and then chromosomes that like double helix form the DNA thing. And then they like coil and coil and coil and all these different things. And then they're within the membrane bound nucleus. So it's a very different type of cell, and it's a whole different level of organization for a cell. And yeah, that's me. I have a couple more slides with different forest friends and a little writing exercise if we're so inclined. But otherwise, I'd like to open up the floor for questions and discussions. And thank you again for having me.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. That was super interesting and actually so much information. I've got a few questions written down, but I'd like to open up to the floor if anyone does have any questions. Would you like to just unmute yourself and go for it?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Go ahead, Clive.
Okay, it's a very obvious one, so please excuse me if it's a stupid one. I mean, firstly, Mica, it was a really, really good talk. It was very clear. Thank you. One thing I wasn't sure about, because I don't know much about Trinidad or the farm, but what do you sell on the farm? Do you sell the plants or the flowers? And what is your market? Is it within Trinidad or is it international?
Excellent questions there, Clive. These are things that I myself am learning. It's a bit of a family farm, and I got back from grad school last year. So there's a bit of a transition in terms of knowledge sharing and transparency of information between my dad and I as the farm manager. I'm sure you can imagine working with family. But generally, we sell flowers. We also do sell plants, and really the flowers have become our bread and butter from a month-to-month basis. And so actually Anna and I were chatting when we were planning this session what the follow-up session will be. So I know you'll have a series of talks, and then at the end, I think I speak again. And I was planning to do a little bit more of a presentation on like the farm as a business and how we kind of make it work. Because that's one of the things that I'm most interested in writing and sharing about, is this sort of how to make the farm work in a modern age with, mechanization rather than the bad old days of slavery and indentured labor. How do you make the farm work? You've got to have multiple different streams of income. We do some ecotourism, we do the flowers, we do some plants. We're working towards becoming a boutique hotel with like 6 to 10 rooms. But right now we do tours in the days, and we've got a couple night hikes. For example, last weekend, a herpetology group, folks particularly interested in snakes and reptiles, came by, and they did a species IDing, and they want to lead night hikes. So yeah, we've got a bunch of different stuff going, and there's the flower mafia of trying to get new varieties of plants. But the flowers are our bread and butter because they produce on a weekly basis, compared to some of the other things like the oranges, which will come once a year. And like the farm does have some cocoa on there, but it is so labor intensive relative to the value you get for selling your cocoa beans that we have not been able to invest in bringing back the cocoa into production right now. We're hoping to do that, but I see it as more of like a 10 to 20 year range activity when we have a steady income from flowers, when our tourism is a little bit more together. Then we can think about investing in repairing and refurbishing our cocoa trees.
So the market for your flowers and plants is in Trinidad, is it?
Yes, yes, indeed. We sell locally, and we're one of the largest local producers of tropical flowers. It's actually interesting. We've been having a bit of a challenge getting into different markets. We have one market which consistently works for us. But even within Trinidad, it's funny because people think of flowers and then they want roses and things like that, which when you go to the florist's fair, you can end up spending 20 US for a rose or 2 roses. Which is just exorbitant when you think about the exchange rate. So we're definitely massaging the system to try and get folks to see if they appreciate local flowers for sale like that.
Great,
And
thank you.
hopefully at much more affordable prices. Gary?
Hi, great talk, by the way. I'm just interested in the geological history of Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah, so geologically, so when you think about plates, right? Plates on the earth, there's the North American plate, South American plate, and the Caribbean plate. So the North American plate and the South American plates are pretty much going this way. And then the Caribbean plate is sort of going this way. So Trinidad is on the edge, sort of a not really fully understood boundary between the South American and the Caribbean plate. So we're at a bit of a transform, but also a bit of a subduction boundary, which means that's why a lot of the Eastern Caribbean has some volcanic activity and stuff like that. So like Trinidad's primary economy driver is oil and gas, which is partially from like effluent of the rivers coming out of South America, the Orinoco, which deposits silt. And then we've got some, so we've got some sedimentary, no volcanic in particular in Trinidad, but up the Caribbean islands, there's more volcanic soil. That's my mom getting home in the background. Yeah, does that help a little bit? Did you want more recent history?
No, that's very good. And also, so what rock type is your bedrock then?
So up at Grosvenor, we have, I want to say it's sedimentary rock, but it's like deep below sedimentary rock with lots of heavy clay soil. So the Brasso is a heavy clay soil, tons of clay. Once you get past the top 5 centimeters, which is fairly organic matter rich, you get into a pale gray brown clay that during it's a vertisol clay, which means it shrinks and swells. So during the dry season, it dries right up and we sometimes get like big fissures and cracks in the soil. And then in the rainy season, it swells right up and like there are certain areas which get mushy and almost quicksand-like with the amount of moisture and then sticky clay particles.
Cool, thank you.
You're welcome.
Beth, I think you're up next.
Yeah, hi, I'd just like to say thank you very much for that. That was really important to learn about. I've got a question about sustainable farming, really. What would you say the importance of soil is in the future of sustainable farming?
So the soil is very much the basis of any plant agriculture, plant-based agriculture. You can have mixed crop livestock systems, which I think are the future, rather than monocropping of only plants or doing, huge concentrated feeding operations and stuff like that. But for plants-based growth, the soil is pretty huge. And for example, with a heavy clay soil like this, like I have to be very careful about the salinity of my soil, because my soil has a really high surface area. The tiny clay particles have tons of surface area on them. And so, for example, one of the pests we have is a snail. It's a giant zebra snail. And commonly in Trinidad, people will throw salt to kill the snails, right? Because they're mollusks and they have the fully permeable skin. And so salt will zap them up via osmosis. But we can't use that on our farm, because if we throw too much salt, it'll affect the salinity, the sodium to aluminum ratio in the soil. And that has impacts that take literally decades to naturally repair themselves, right? And so there are things like, the loss of topsoil when you do when you cut trees in the area because the leaves are no longer dropping consistently is huge in terms of your decision-making process of, okay, do I want more sunlight for my crops, or do I want to maintain the topsoil by keeping my trees, dropping leaf litter? Or if I cut my trees, then do the roots holding soil in position no longer exist, and then I get slippage in my clay soil over time. So there's lots of really important questions from a framework level of maintaining your soil to maintain your crop, livestock, whatever system you have going.
Thank you so much. And also, just to let you know, I think there's a question from Lynn in the chat because she can't raise her hand. So at some point you can look there.
Thank you. And maybe Anna can read that for us in a second.
Well, I think Liz had her hand up first, and then I was going to call on Lynn after that. If you still want to ask a question, Liz?
Thanks. I think it was partly answered. I was going to ask about damage to soil. So I think Mica's kind of pretty much done that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, Lynn, I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, thank you very much. This has been great, Mica. I didn't think I'd be interested in hearing about soil. You did a really great job of explaining things. It's made it really interesting. The question I have is, you could, if you want to just talk about Trinidad, you can, but if you want to talk about globally, you could. I want to know, what are the major threats to good, healthy soil? What is happening with the soil on our planet, and should we be concerned about it? And is there stuff that we can be doing or should be doing?
Okay. So one of the major threats to soil, thank you for that question, a great one, Lynn. So the threats to soil, the first one that comes to my mind is erosion and loss of topsoil. So erosion is the removal of particles suspended in solution, usually in runoff due to heavy rainfall, and often associated with deforestation and stuff like that. So when you cut the trees, there's less of a layer protecting the impact, lessening the impact of the soil or of the raindrops on the soil. So like if the edge of my screen is the soil, if you have a canopy, as the rain falls down, it slows down and its impact is lessened on the soil. Versus without a canopy, you get harder rainfall and it splashes up and removes soil particles, which then run away in solution. So deforestation is a huge impact on erosion. And that really, when you lose your soil, it's gone. And particularly if you've deforested the area, there's no longer organic matter being fed into the system from the top of that horizon, and then sinking slowly down through the soil to reproduce healthy soil. So the organic matter percentage of a quote unquote healthy soil can often be considered something like about 2%. 2% is sort of like a functional, decent amount. But like in a rainforest, you could have even as much as 5% in like the top 30 centimeters of soil. And that would be a really healthy, organic matter rich soil. So I'm hesitant to say there, right, that a soil with a higher organic matter percentage is healthier. But there is a lot of discourse around soil health and what we can do to improve or maintain soil health. So there's lots of interesting metrics like potassium permanganate oxidizable carbon, which is essentially like fast cycling carbon, organic carbon in the soil. There's protein nitrogen in the soil, which is kind of cool because it captures both the microbial as well as decaying organic matter portion of the soil. So those were some of the analyses that I used in my grad studies to think about the health of different systems. One of the things that we can do, or that was traditionally thought of as a great way to rest your soil in between crop cycles would be to fallow your soil. Fallow just meaning rest a period without your crop. But what we've learned is actually that a cover crop is actually more efficient than just not having anything on your soil. So rather than leaving it bare, you would plant something, and often planting something that will add good stuff to your soil. For example, a perennial grass or a legume which has natural nitrogen fixation in the root nodules is a really good thing to plant in your soil system. Also, just from a, again, very agricultural perspective here, you know, mixed crop livestock systems, intercrop systems with, you know, tomato and basil planted next to each other. Syntropy is a really cool system of crop production that folks are using that kind of uses both the time scale as well as organic matter inputs of different crops and reaping at different times. Yeah, basically the opposite of what you're seeing with big pharma is what will help you maintain your soil health, you know. Not monocropping, or at least crop rotation. So if you're using a big field, the first year you put corn, then the next year you put cotton, then the year after that you do carrots or whatever. And that has a variety of good things, both for your yield as well as the soil maintenance over time. And then cover cropping is a big one. Cover cropping was one of the main things studied in my lab. And cover cropping with like a variety of mixed things. So like, you know, if you want to rest your field that year, maybe you do, so the system that I worked in was like cotton, peanut, bahia grass or bahia grass, or you could even then do 2 years of bahia grass before you go back to cotton and peanut. But, you know, doing things like that requires more expansive soils, more expansive systems. You're not growing food or saleable goods on the area that you're resting in that year, which has, you know, serious impacts for farmers, especially when you're considering if you're a farmer renting your land rather than the person who owns the land they're working on. So yeah, people are often in a difficult situation. So I think there needs to be government incentives to help support folks in making decisions that support like the slow food movement, for example.
Esther, I can see you have your hand up there.
Wondering, especially from your perspective.
Uh-oh, I can't hear you too well, Esther.
Sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, thanks.
I was wondering, especially from your perspective, as working on your own farm, whether you thought there's anything that governments can do to help maintain soil health and support farmers, and especially within agriculture.
Yes, thank you, Esther. That is a great question. It's a huge question as well. I will speak very specifically to Trinidad and the history of agriculture in Trinidad first, because I think that is an important sort of framework. So in Trinidad, we had, as I mentioned earlier, the bad old days of slavery and indentured labor. And so that left a huge impact on our culture in how we look at agricultural labor and farming in general. So from the government's perspective and from the general cultural perspective in Trinidad, a lot of people look down on farming as being, you know, slave walk. And so that creates big challenges even today in a post-colonial situation, in a modern globalized era, in terms of folks wanting to even be involved in agriculture as a start. So I think that the government is actually doing some really great stuff with initiatives like the Youth Agriculture Homestead Program and the Ministry of Agriculture's educational programs to try and increase the general knowledge about the ability to farm in the tropics. I personally feel like everybody in Trinidad who has a backyard should be growing some food, because the sun is hitting us all year round. And you know, it's not hard to do. You just got to water a little bit, or you know, it's challenging. There's a growing process and the growing curve to growing your food. But I think that it would improve our food security a lot. And there's lots of really great groups trying to work on educating. There's Global Shapers, who I got a really awesome little grant from to do community gardens. There's organizations like Wasamaki educating about the slow food movement, and syntropy, where you can grow multiple crops in your backyard in a relatively small area. So I think the work is being done, but the receptiveness of the population is what it is. And of course, I think, you know, government budgets could be increased for agriculture and that sort of thing. Yes, Sam. And then we'll go Gary after. You're muted, Sam. Are you trying to ask a question? I saw you raised your hand.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I really loved it. I love it. I was gonna ask you some question because you talked a bit about the pests which attacks your crops. I was wondering what sort of approach what sort of mechanism are you using to eradicate or to reduce the pests on your land so that your plants can survive? And also the other thing which I was gonna ask you, which I didn't hear maybe in the beginning, is for how long has your farm been in existence or being farmed? And do you have a problem in terms of soil depletion? And if you do, what sort of ideas can you advise somebody if you have depleted land?
Great question, Sam. Thank you, thank you. Okay, so I will say, okay, so first a brief history of Grosvenor. It was an estate, it was a cocoa estate for a while, a long while, and again in the bad old days, which was owned by the Grosvenor family, who were British at one point or another in our history. The land came into my family about 40, 50 years ago during my grandpa's time. And since then, we've done a variety of different things in the central portion of it, but there's still tons of cocoa on the external portions that have not been farmed, that have kind of gone back to the forest for the most part. We do some agroforestry, we do some lumber, some selective logging. My grandpa had sheep and goats, you know, before I was born. You know, I went clearing, and one of the things we end up doing is really, it's quite amazing, the tropics, right? So we're 10 degrees north of the equator. You leave a piece of that land fallow for 10 years and the whole forest regrows. So about 5 years ago, I went into an area that like was near to the main buildings, but was completely forested. And, you know, there were trees and huge heliconias as tall as me, 6 foot, 7 foot into the air. And I started clearing and I found a concrete plinth and a building that had, you know, that used to be a cattle stall in my grandpa's day, you know, 20 years before. And my dad was like, whoa, what is that? What are you talking about? A concrete structure like off of that road? And I was like, I don't know, man. So it's pretty exciting in terms of regrowth. The soil has rested pretty well in various times. So we don't have really depleted soils in any big way. But what I would do for depleted soils is I would begin with organic matter. I would grow grasses, which have deep roots, and legumes, which organically add nitrogen to the soil. And I would do things like cut and drop. So you can like cut plant material and then just drop it right there on the ground, which leaves mulch, which breaks down and slowly seeps into the soil. And that's sort of how I would begin to ameliorate a soil system. Organic amendments break down really slowly and they release nutrients really slowly, which is nice in terms of building up a microbial community and kind of kick-starting the metabolism of your soil. And then, okay, to manage pests, the last part of your question, which you asked first, but sort of, I got there. So at Grosvenor, we employ a kind of mixed approach, right? I studied agriculture and soils and nutrient cycling. And really, in my opinion, if you are going to do a fully organic system, a fully pest-free system, you have to have a truly massive area and be okay with really, really low production that happens slowly over time, which is fine, but it's also really labor intensive because all of this stuff has to be done either by you or some other organism, right? So there are some areas of Grosvenor where we're working on organic farming and we've designed the beds in such a way that we can put like a mobile chicken enclosure so that we can put the chickens in like a 2 meter by 10 meter or 2 foot by 6 foot long movable coop where they can maintain the rows in between our beds. And then they will peck and eat the weeds and stuff like that, and then recycle the nutrients. And that'll help us weed the area while, not employing too many pesticides and herbicides. But the truth of the matter is that it's just really challenging to not use pesticides, herbicides, or fertilizer in your farming. And so we kind of mix and match. We kind of do as little as we can. We try to reduce our pesticides. And there are definitely parts of the farm where I work solely on an organic basis, but there are parts of the farm where we use traditional herbicides and pesticides to maintain our crop production. The snails in particular, we are just struggling with right now. There's a Ministry of Agriculture drive where they're actually paying you for, I think it's like 5 TT for a kilogram of snails. And so I'm hoping to do a volunteer action over the next couple of weeks where we have folks up to just come and help us collect snails, and then we'll see if the Ministry of Agriculture will take them from us.
Amazing.
Anna's laughing because she's not here. She would have otherwise been up on the farm collecting snails.
Thank you.
Gary?
You might want to start breeding snails if they pay for you to have them. But
that's how they were originally introduced, actually. It's a terrible story.
Yeah. My original question though was, soils are a great store for carbon. How would we go about increasing the amount of carbon stored in soils?
Carbon storage. Well done, Gary. That is the big decision question. It's a discussion point. That was basically my thesis in graduate school. So I could talk to you for quite some time about carbon storage in the soil. Well, okay. So it's great. Carbon storage in the soil is the soil is a huge potential sink for carbon dioxide. You can have all of these microbes and you can have organic matter in the soil, but it's also like a mixed bag. Like the potential is very variable depending on the underlying soil type that you have, right? So some soils just have a smaller potential carbon sequestration. And so one of the things that, and I think maybe to touch on Esther's question a little bit earlier as well, is that like, how do you motivate, right? What can governments do to encourage carbon sequestration? And then also, how do you measure it consistently is one of the big questions, right? And so the notion of the carbon sequestration potential of your soil, so understanding what the baseline potential for carbon sequestration in soils that are kind of natural ecosystem soils in the nearby area with the same soil type matters. And then figuring out how and what you make payments for within that carbon sequestration discussion also matters. So do you make payments for achieving a certain goal of carbon sequestration? Do you make payments for maintaining a certain percentage of organic matter in your soil? You know, how do you incentivize it? And then is it an incentive that's paid out slowly over time? Or is it an incentive that pays out only at some point and that's the only point? Because all of those things matter in terms of how much you'll get people to adopt it and then how much you'll get people to maintain it. For example, if there's a system that pays out, you know, when you reach to a certain percentage, you might get folks working to get to that percentage, they get their payout, and then they just drop the techniques because it's no longer useful. But then if you have a system where you're paying to maintain a certain something, then that's a huge cost for governments over time. So basically you can plant different things for different impacts on your carbon. And depending on what you plant, depending on like the life cycle of the plant, there's also an interesting discussion of like, you know, if I'm planting to increase carbon sequestration and I'm planting trees, but then at the end, after 40 years, I receive my payment and then I sell all my trees and they get logged, you know, what's happening? Some carbon was sequestered, but now we've moved carbon. This lumber is getting cut up, sold, moved, however far away in the world. What is the sort of life cycle analysis of the carbon sequestration attempts that we made? And maybe, you know, to meet a certain organic matter quota in my soil, I watered my trees and then I put fertilizer on them. So are we taking into account the watering and the fertilizer, the carbon cost of those when we're counting against, you know, getting to a carbon soil target at a certain time point? So there's a ton of different things and like the sort of focus of your level, right? Because it can't just be on what plants sequester the most carbon. It also has to be what is the growing system that we're using and a whole bunch of external inputs, along with how do we measure this consistently? So that's why I mentioned POC and autoclave extractable carbon, nitrogen, as these different measures of the organic fraction of the soil that I was investigating in peanut and cotton fields of northern Florida.
Sam, is that a hand up I see?
Yes, I was quite interested in that question, and I wanted to see what is your take, because I'm very much interested in biochar, making biochar, and I've been doing this for quite a long time. What is your take on biochar when you're talking about this carbon dioxide trapping?
Yes. Well, I mean, you did ask for my personal take. So yeah. I will share with you my opinion on biochar. I think that biochar, I get it, right? People are very excited about biochar as an organic amendment right now. I think that the main thing that biochar is doing in your soil is adding specific surface area. Which is to say that you're adding surface area for other things to linger on in your soil. So biochar, and I mean, so I hear you, right, with the life cycle analysis of biochar and biochar production. Biochar, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically blackened carbon And it can be produced in a variety of ways, you know, with various heats and pressure and oxygen conditions, and even like source material. So I know folks who were studying like biochar and the porosity of the molecule and the nutrients involved and the nutrients burned off and the cost of energy production of biochar. And in short, I think biochar is a bit of an overblown thing. I think that the most useful application for biochar is if you're going to do it with compost. And so some of the studies that I've seen that showed the most positive effect of biochar essentially showed that it helped give more surface area in the soil for organisms to accumulate, and different little pockets and holes for microbes to live in the molecule that was created after burning the carbon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. There is quite a lot to think about, but I think it's quite exciting what you talked about. And it's quite an interesting one in terms of, as you said, creating a space for the microorganism or for the mycorrhizas, or for creating the right conditions for microbes to become expansive, which we need in the soil.
That we do. And I mean, for one last little bit on biochar, it's super interesting, like how you define it. Because again, I knew folks who were studying it in the lab and producing it under like, you know, 0.02 oxygen and heat and pressure and stuff like that. So it's interesting even in terms of how you define biochar, because a lot of folks who make biochar at home in their farm and stuff like that, you know, they're essentially creating a fire and burning wood. And so you're creating coal and you're creating ash. And so according to some scientists who I know, you know, that's not biochar unless it was created under certain heat and pressure conditions, unless you got to a certain level of heat and so on and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that you're adding carbon to the soil, and with that carbon, you're adding surface area, whether it is biochar made in a lab with specific oxygen and pressure conditions and reaching 200 Celsius, or you're creating an oven, or you're using the ash and the coals from your barbecue pit to throw into your soil with your organic matter or your compost material.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I live in a land which is mainly alkaline land, lots of limestone. And I agree with you to add biochar to the compost, and also to have other combinations whereby biochar can be more important in acidic soils too.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Sam, for your question. Liz, do you want to ask a last question here before I got to run off to the market to price flowers and label them?
I'll try and make it short if nobody else wants one. I just wanted to ask, well, firstly, I'll say that here we have a real problem with too much nitrogen in the soils because of too much animal waste is used. And I wonder if you could just tell us how it works for you in Trinidad and Tobago.
It did occur to me to do a little bit more reading up on like what some of the soil issues are in the UK, but I did not have the time for it. So that's interesting. Too much nitrogen in your soils. I know like an excess of nitrogen in waterways is also a big problem in like the States, and nitrogen and phosphorus, of course, giving you eutrophication, algal blooms, and deoxygenating your water systems, fish deaths, and all kind of stuff like that. Regulation is one part of it, right? Regulating how much fertilizer you're allowed to put per area for different crops and stuff like that. I know fertilizer sale is much more regulated in the UK, for example, than it is in the US, far less in Trinidad. So that is definitely a part of it, right? How much fertilizer you're adding to the system. And then in terms of animal waste, I'm actually pretty in favor of manure as an additive rather than inorganic dissolvable nitrogen. So like urea fertilizer, ammonia fertilizer, that kind of thing. But well, I like the animal waste manure fertilizer for the fact that you get a slower breakdown of nitrogen and so therefore a slower return to the soil. But what I think you might be talking about also is these sort of concentrated CAFOs. I think it's a CAFO, the concentrated feeding operation, and basically like factory farming of animals. Because what happens then is that you have like a huge buildup, and then you get you know, like literal like ponds, retention ponds of cow manure or whatever it is. And those, of course, do have a huge impact on any local system. So
Interrupt a moment. Do you have much of that going on in Trinidad and Tobago? None at all?
No.
Okay.
I mean, we definitely do have folks doing livestock and stuff like that. But in Trinidad, in general, a lot of the farms tend to be small, medium-sized farms. Like the average farm, I believe, is something like 5 hectares, if that, in Trinidad. So it's very much subsistence farming, small backyard scale farming. And so the issues that we have are more that folks need to come together in like cohorts and like to make farming community groups so that they can kind of leverage their production a little bit better. We don't have a huge dairy industry like the UK or the US have. So I think a lot of our dairy is actually imported. I'm very excited about goats and want to make goat cheese. So I want to get goats, but that's like a whole, you know, a level of daily maintenance, which I'm not at yet. But one of the things I'm hoping to do in the next couple of years is to go to Ireland, where I have like ancestry and family, and do woofing worldwide opportunities in organic farming at like at a goat farm. So I've had woofers come and visit me here, and I'm hoping to have others, and I'm hoping to go and do some woofing to learn about goats and cheese making.
Sounds great. Thank you.
And I know, Mike, you just said you have to run off very soon. So if anyone has any last questions, speak now.
This isn't a question, but I just had a recommendation of a Netflix documentary about soil health. It's called Kiss the Ground, and talks about regenerative farming and carbon sequestration, and using soil to reduce global emissions. So if anyone's interested, you should go and look that up. It's called Kiss the Ground.
Sweet, thank you, Beth. And that definitely will help folks who are interested in the conversation of carbon sequestration and different organic methods that can help foster that, with possibly a more hopeful spin than I had.
Lovely.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Beth. That's great. I'm going to have a look at that. Right, so I think we have come to the end of our evening. And, you know, Mica, thank you so much for your time tonight, this afternoon for you. And everybody, you know, really appreciate you being here. We are really lucky to have our amazing Stroud Young Green members who have organized and, you know, run this mostly. And they're really enthusiastic, and that completely inspires me. And I hope that this talk and them have inspired you all as well. And, you know, they really motivate our group. So I really want to say thank you to all of you members as well for being here tonight and for doing this talk for us, because it's really been very interesting for me, and I hope very interesting for everyone else as well. Before we close off, are there any last words from any of the Young Green members? No, everyone's good? Great. And then I just want to highlight our next event on the 23rd of February, which is a tree planting at Days Orchard, and more information will follow on that one. And then, of course, we are lucky enough, as Mica mentioned, to have him come back for a second talk. Thank you very much. And that is happening on the 8th of March. Again, more information will be disseminated on that a little closer to the time. But I wanted to push those plugs there in case anyone is interested in coming to either of those, or as well, please spread the word on both of those events and also the Stroud Young Greens, in case you know anyone that's interested in joining our wonderful kind of community here. But really it is just to say a huge thank you to everyone for your time this evening and this afternoon. And we look forward to the next time. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.